About Pantoum poetry. I particularly enjoy teaching about Pantoum poetry because it gives the author a lot of room to play around with language within a very specific structure and form. So let's talk about what Pantoum poetry is. And this example, Dancing Hands by Heather Harvey, is probably one of the most perfect examples you'll find. There are a lot of different types of Pantoum that could be considered imperfect, and that has to do with variance in rhyme scheme and length and how the poem is concluded. But either way, that's perfectly fine. To look at different ways to do it, we'll look at this perfect example here in front of us. So the first thing that makes a pantoum is the number of lines in each stanza. And that means it is or what I mean by that is there are 4 lines, which makes each stanza a quatrain, a series of 4 lines in a stanza. The next thing is the rhyme scheme. It follows an A B rhyme scheme, which means the first and third lines rhyme and the second and fourth lines rhyme in each individual stanza. So that pattern continues throughout the poem. A, B, for each individual stanza. So the next thing, and probably the most unique thing about a pantoum, which makes it a pantoum, is the repetition of lines from stanza to stanza. So let's get into it. Let's read a little bit of this poem, and we'll take it piecemeal and look at what makes this poem a pantoum. So let's look at the first stanza. Again your hand begins to draw. I feel my fingers live and warm. We sketch and shade the wrists and more as each of each creates the form. So that has an A B rhyme scheme. Now, for anybody who's being very attentive, you might say that draw and more don't rhyme. Well, that's kind of true, but this is called a slant rhyme, where you take words that have similar sounds, especially when the sounds are vowels. They have similar sounds, and you can kind of link them together to almost rhyme. So that's called an off rhyme or a slant rhyme. Some people call it a forced rhyme. And you can do that. It's a tool that's been used by everybody from Christopher Marlowe to Heather Harvey right here in front of you. It's an opportunity to force a word to work in a structure. And again, you can look it up. It's called off rhyme or slant rhyme, and it's used by authors all the time. So this is a perfect example of a teachable moment. Draw and more are actually considered rhyming words in this poem. So we've read the first stanza. Now let's read the second. I feel my fingers live and warm, my lifeblood flows in every vein, as each of each creates the form, we draw and pause and draw again. So this is more perfect in terms of its rhyming structure. You can see that warm, form, vein, again. And again, that it's how you pronounce the word again. It could be again, but it's all in the pronunciation or how you force that rhyme. So we've got the rhyme scheme A, B, but if you were very attentive, you would have noticed that the second line of the first stanza, I feel my fingers live and warm, becomes the first line of the second stanza, I feel my fingers live and warm. And the fourth line, as each of each creates the form, becomes the third line of the next stanza, as each of each creates the form. And that pattern continues throughout the poem until the last stanza. So let's take a look at the next stanza. My lifeblood flows in every vein, be careful, you're cheating me. We draw and pause and draw again, we shape each other, both hands free. So again, we've got the rhyme scheme, A, B, me and free, and vain and again, they do rhyme. But you've also got that repetitiveness of the second line becoming the first, and the fourth line becoming the third. And that pattern continues into the next stanza. Be careful, you're cheating me. Don't make your lines too faint or rough. We shape each other, both hands free. But is this paper big enough? So we've got our rhyme scheme, me, free, rough, enough. And we've got our repetition. Be careful, you're cheating me. The second line becomes the first, and the fourth becomes the third. Now, where that differs in a perfect pantoum is in the fifth stanza, or in an imperfect pantoum in the final stanza. It could be 1,000 stanzas long, it doesn't matter. You can change up the repetition. So what you've got here is, in terms of the final stanza, you follow, again, the same pattern for the second line becoming the first. So let's read it. Don't make your lines too faint or rough. We sketch and shade the wrists and more, but is this paper big enough? Again, your hands begin to draw. So, in a very traditional pantoum, the way to conclude is to follow that pattern of second becoming first and fourth becoming third, but to get the second and fourth lines of the final stanza, we go back to stanza 1. So if you look, we sketch and shade the wrists and more. That is actually the third line of the final stanza. And the final line of the poem, again your hands begin to draw, is taken from the first line of the poem. So that's a perfect and traditional pantoum style. It's very challenging to do. I hope you enjoy having a stab at this type of form, and I really look forward to seeing what you come up with.